What's up, everyone? Happy Wednesday, and welcome to the game on Pack State Live, the show where we talk about all the cybersecurity shenanigans you need to be aware of. We're gonna have a really cool episode. We're gonna talk about leaky clouds, incidents, events, and some other things. Uh, but before we do that, let me get through housekeeping. Please interact with us. But if you're going to interact with us, make sure you do it on YouTube so that our producers can see it and get you on screen. That's youtube.com/PackStateCloud. Don't forget to sign up for Pack State Beyond. It's already 50% full. And if you're in EMEA, Pack State Berlin is coming up here in a couple months, here in October. So make sure you get your spot for that as well. With that in mind, let's bring in Matt and kick off the show.
What is up, Dom? Listen, man, I'm not the best reader, but there's like an S and an R in the front of your title there as I read it. Did you have a job change?
Yeah, I did have a title change. Yeah, just a little one. A little realignment. Pretty exciting. A little more equity, if I'm being honest.
Congratulations. Equity's great. More responsibilities, great. So congrats. Just glad to see it, brothers. So, all right, what are we talking about today, Dom? You kind of kicked it off with, does your cloud leak? And maybe let's set the stage for this before we get going, because we're going to be talking about incident response, right? And we're going to be talking about, detecting incidents, at least to some extent, and, from the lens of an MSP that's going through this. But to set the stage for people, everything seems to be shifting towards SaaS resources, especially for the SMB, non-code producing entities in our world that we serve. And in addition to that, most people are following the prescriptive advice from CIS of 5.6 saying, hey, centralize your accounts, right? Go to an SSO methodology. Hey, centralize your access control. Go and bring that back through SCIM and through other extensibilities to say, what should I have access to from one central IDP? Well, that's usually going to be what I want to attack. That's the juicy bits that gets me into everything else. And so we're going to talk about a couple of ways that happens and a couple of ways that, a pretty awesome MSP is detecting those things. So anything else to add before we get going, Dom? What's our one play? Anything else?
Oh, I mean, I think our one play, we're going to see, but I think it's going to round out to pay attention to your incidents and events, right? Because if you don't, you're going to miss the one.
Wait, you're saying that Sentinel-1, you don't just like set it and leave it alone? You have to actually look at what's happening? This is blowing my mind right now, Dom Kirby.
Nuts. In fact, no platform is set it and forget it, and there is no such thing as cyber immunity. So,
yeah,
we just have to punch
only for $99
every chance we get. No, that package is $101. That's why we're not cyber immune.
Oh, I see. We were short a bit. That's fair. All right. Well, you know what? Let's hear some brilliant words from Robin Harris, and we'll come back and join Ian and team to talk about some incidents.
Are you ready?
We're going to do a little mini series, and we're going to talk about data. And we're going to look at it from different lenses and different perspectives. And we're going to kick this off with a recent breach that happened that involved 2.9 billion records. A company that does background checks. That means they've got social security numbers, addresses. And what's interesting about this situation is the data was stored unencrypted. That's like you went and applied for a job, you give them your information, and you go and do the background check is supposed to make the company safe, but it's not supposed to make the applicant unsafe. And I want to just talk about data stewardship. What happens is companies and humans become desensitized to the risk because they are not thinking about what's the value of this data to a threat actor, and what's the impact if this data were lost or compromised. So we're so used to dealing with all of this data that it just does not register that you wouldn't put 2.9 billion records with social security numbers into an unencrypted storage location. That's one of the basic tenets. How do you protect data at rest, data in transit, and data that's being processed? And you think about it, how many times are people putting data in your SharePoint? Maybe your HR people are putting data in it. Maybe people are putting client data in it. What companies have to do is really become data sensitive and data aware and put in that data classification policy and then educate staff throughout the whole company on how do we classify data, and based on how that data is classified, how do we handle it? How do we protect it? Because this is a culture thing. We can all become desensitized to the importance of the data we have stewardship of. People are trusting us with their data. That's so sensitive. Your social security number is with you from cradle to grave. So much can be done with that data. It never expires. People can even do things with it after you're long gone, right? And because we are human, we don't want to just rely on tribal knowledge for people to do the right thing. Sometimes it's really, really good to have that checklist. Did you encrypt? Did you set certain types of data sensitivity labels? You might not know this, but airline pilots love checklists. So when you're going to fly someplace, that airline, they've got very deep, detailed checklists, because missing one thing can be a disaster. So they're not trying to go off the top of their head. They have a checklist and they just go down the line. Did I do this, and this? And that's kind of where we probably need to go with data and how we manage it based on the sensitivity of that data, the risk to that data, the attractiveness of that data to threat actors, the implications of if that data were lost. We're just gonna have to really change how we think about data. Now, we've talked about the breach. In the next episode, we're gonna talk about what happens when people make a mistake and what the consequences of mistakes can be when it comes to data.
Time to level up. Level up.
I mean,
Well,
come on.
I mean-
Unencrypted. Really?
Yeah. Like control 3.11, right? Encrypt sensitive data at rest. I mean, that is kind of a basic, IG2, IG3.
Or just
I think,
common
in that
sense,
case.
you know?
It'd be certainly
I don't
common
know.
sense.
Encryption
yeah.
is widely accessible and free. I'm just saying. Like, it's not hard.
It is. It is. In fact, you used some Missouri encryption in your web that you just encoded yesterday for a thing we're doing. But I digress.
It's so secure.
I guess
yeah.
base 64 is not secure.
And very fast.
And the other side of it is, I mean, if you think about it, there's not much more sensitive data than the combination of all the things one needs to identify me in one place.
Yes.
So it would be very hard to argue not having some form of protection so if that data is stolen. But even when we're sitting in the off side here, I don't want to mislead people, right? A lot of the systems that do encrypt data at rest are not necessarily going to protect them. It's not like Azure Information Protection where you're giving some portable encryption that must be asserted every time. If you're just doing BitLocker, the machine's on and the operating system's up. If you get access through that path, even as that non-privileged user, you have access to whatever that non-privileged user has access to first and foremost. And then when you think about like function services or database services, Dom, you and I were talking about this before, where one of the things you read about, and if you just want to explain it real quick about the Lambda function in AWS.
The challenge
bucket,
was,
right?
This particular environment stored data in AWS, and they did encrypt it, and the key was in KMS, which is a great practice. But you could call the get Lambda function, which would pull whatever data you wanted, and as part of its workstream would decrypt it. So it was meaningless.
Exactly.
I mean, obviously the authentication was broken. It was probably some kind of IDOR, but it renders the encryption useless. So at the second you're using the data, or the microsecond as it were, it has to be unencrypted. So even if you're doing record encryption, where it's encrypted before it's committed to the database or any of that, when you're using the data, you cannot use it if it's encrypted, which is the whole point, right? So there's always that.
What about homomorphic encryption, Dom? That's going to save us. Oh, never mind.
Totally.
I guess we're not in the future yet. Yeah. Okay, fair. Let's move on to the real part of our show here. So why don't we kick off? What are we doing today, Dom?
Oh, well, we got a couple of great guests. Let's get them in here and let's just let's introduce them. Ian,
All right.
Curtis, how's it going?
Ian, Curtis.
It's going good. How's it going, guys? Appreciate you having us
Hey
on.
guys.
So my name is Ian Romero. I'm COO at K3 Technology based out of Denver, Colorado, and newly in the Dallas market as well. We just acquired a smaller MSP in Dallas, so we're out there as well. And I got
Hey, and
Curtis
my
with
name
me
is
as well.
Curtis Branum. Oh, sorry about that. My name is Curtis Branum. I am the NOC manager at K3 Technology. I'm based out of Dallas in our new territory here, and I get the pleasure of managing the service delivery side of things, and that includes security incidents as well.
That's fun. I wound up with the incident response title inside of our MSP, at least as owning it. Matt Topper owned the other half of it for me on rotations. But as the NOC manager and service manager, does that really put you pretty close to the action during these incidents? So are you normally the one investigating them as well, Curtis, and getting down that path, or does your team handle that in that first step? Tell me how that plays for y'all.
Yeah, so I would say our team handles that in our first step. So we aren't a huge MSP. We have a small, tight-knit team. So in a lot of cases, our service desk also operates as a security operations center for our client, right? So I am an escalation point, but I try to provide the tools and resources that I can for our service desk to be successful.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
and I
Do
think
you guys
Curtis.
already have a? Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Ian.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say I think Curtis might be a little modest to an extent. He jumps in a lot. He's definitely a hands-on manager, which I appreciate, right? I think that it takes a certain amount of getting hands-on and kind of jumping in with his team members to figure out what's going on. And that's, I would say, to an extent, part of the training is actually going through the process of how can we identify this as a true positive or false positive, and what are the right next steps to take? How do we communicate that to the client and so on? And I think he does a really good job with that. We love having Curtis on the team for sure.
That's awesome. Well, you guys brought a slide deck. We're going to dig in and get nerdy with it. So let's dig in and go into the play of the game, play of the day today.
Awesome. Let's do
All
it.
right.
Yeah, so am I going? All right, so yeah, we got a few things we're going to cover. What is a security incident? I know you wanted to kind of keep the rhetorical stuff to a minimum, so we'll try not to spend a whole lot of time on that and kind of jump into the guts. But I do think it's important to kind of go through that. Curtis is going to kind of take us a little bit through what tool sets and partnerships we have set up to help with the detection of incidents. Then we're going to kind of go into some somewhat kind of deep dives into some incidents we've actually received and how we responded to them. And then a couple of conclusions to wrap things up. So, what is a security incident? I bet Matt probably has some answers on this, but I guess I'll start
No,
us
I'm going to
off
let
and
you
then
go with it,
we'll let.
buddy.
So, one of the reasons I wanted to have these first few slides is I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about what is an incident, what do we actually kind of define that as, and where do we kind of separate the line of this is just a support request or this is actually potentially a security incident. And then furthermore, when does that actually become a breach, and understanding that security incident is not always a breach, right? So a security incident is any event that could potentially compromise the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, systems, or services. So, I mean, I can think of a lot of things that could potentially be. I mean, that could be something as small as an end user puts a support request in or an HR folder. The support engineer doesn't make sure they have the proper approval for that. Now, somebody within the company has access to information that they shouldn't have, right? So they have essentially unauthorized access. Is that a breach? No. Security incident? Yes, probably so. Um, not all
I'm glad you
incidents.
I'm glad you got into it. I'm going to stop us right here because God bless us, I got to do
Yeah.
it. Anytime we use the B word on this show, we have to make sure that we're really clear, right? And so the B word on this show is breach. And for anybody watching right now, if you ever say the word breach, you better be willing to defend that it's a breach. You have now probably made it one, at least in a lot of places. When you think about it, an incident and an event are delineable. An event might be some small item, a small password spray attempt, things of that nature, whereas an incident is going to be another classification above that, where something maybe did happen. Someone got compromised of an account or an identity, but perhaps they didn't actually touch the C, confidentiality of something, the integrity or availability of something. And so we have to learn as MSPs that two things. Number one, you need to have a difference between an event, an incident, and a breach. And number two, when it comes to breach, there better be a comma space ESQ period after your name, or you better be willing to sit and argue with me tit for tat and Dom tit for tat on whether it was a breach or not. The point is that we shouldn't be the ones making those determinations. Attorneys should, and incident responders should, that are willing to financially and fiduciarily back their statement up to and including necessarily defending it if needed in court. And so I just want to make sure, since we did call it out, we gave some prescriptive advice to say, take that out of your lexicon unless an attorney gave it to you, in my mind. So great. We had to say it here. So Ian, that wasn't on you. Just wanted to say it.
Yeah, no, I knew you were going to dive in on this. I was waiting for it.
Yeah.
and I appreciate
We've
it.
met before. Yeah.
Poland is true.
All right, let's keep going.
And,
Sorry.
And so to Matt's point, what is the impact? Not all incidents lead to harm or successful breach, and that's why we kind of want to be careful with those, right? Many are detected and handled before causing damage or data exposure. Think of it as a red flag that something needs attention. And I think the important call out here, especially as we kind of talk about what is the difference between events, incidents, and breaches, I think this is where MSPs can really help their clientele out is, at least bringing the information to the table for the client so far as, hey, this is what happened. This is what the impact was. Here's what we can tell was actually exposed. Here's kind of maybe some stuff that we're not really sure about yet that we can, potentially continue to investigate for you and then kind of figure out how far did this exposure get? And then to your point, Matt, let them bring in the right resources to kind of determine what the right next actions are and how do they want to classify that event/incident/breach. So go ahead and go to the next slide.
I just want to call out, so your example there of saying no sensitive data is compromised because the click was intercepted and blocked, whatever it was blocked by, right? The key is that was still an event or incident for you, right? Because you're hopefully looking at how did that email get through? What were the heuristics? Is this something new? So that at a bare minimum, there's a lessons learned on how that email even got to the user's inbox, right? Or you could start to look out for patterns and repetition and new iterations, right? So that was still an event for you or an incident, however you classed it, and you still did something about it, even though it was stopped, right? It did not become a larger incident.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And one of the other things I want to call out too that's pretty big is when you're looking at this as an MSP, or at least when I was, I can only speak to when I was, I really was hesitant to try to be the smartest guy in the room when it came to that. Right? What could I tell them? I could tell them things I could easily understand. I could tell them what I could get out of my tooling. I could tell them what I could get from my MDR team. But was I going to be the one that wanted to sit in court and be the one that was forensically going to say, here's what happened? Or did I simply want to actually be the conduit to that? So the way we approached it in our incident response plan was our first decision was, did we cause this? Is there a pretty high likelihood we caused this, right? If those cases were yes, then I might want to engage my insurance and my attorney and my counsel and my teams on incident. But if the answer was no to that first question, at least in that preponderance of belief and Occam's razor perspective, then the next step for me was going to be, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Client, do you want to bring in incident response teams? Do you want to contact your insurance? Do you have cyber insurance or things of that nature? Because they needed to make a decision. I didn't want to be the one holding the ball. I said all that to say, Ian, it sounds like you're saying the first step is really just kind of triage, at least getting a understanding of containment. Do we think we know what happened? Is it within our skill set? But if it goes beyond that, do you give the advice for customers to bring in their own counsel? I think it sounds like what you were talking about in their own insurance, if that's the case, if you don't believe you caused it, is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think kind of the important call out there too, I think, is most likely your MSP agreement shouldn't be set up to include incident response, or to that extent, right? And I think as an MSP, you got to ask yourself, if you have a 20-person client that you maybe bringing in a few grand a month, is that worth you spending potentially hundreds of hours on the post recovery remediation and everything else that might come along with any potential litigation, depending on if that turned into the B word and everything else. So it's important to triage it properly, I think, and bring the right information to the client and potentially give them the right data to make the right decision and kind of lead them to an extent.
Well
But
said.
at some point, you got to determine where does that line kind of get drawn, if that makes sense.
And our contract was
100%.
contained. Like, we're going to contain the threat, isolate it with whatever mechanisms we have available to us, and then the client gets to make a decision. I had a client who had a ransomware incident. Granted, this was pre-double extortion, right? It was raw ransomware, and they decided, like, nah, just restore the backups, and we got all that in writing, and we restored the backups, right? And that was the extent of our incident response. And we obviously took it internal and figured out how it got past EDR. Actually, it was AV at the time, but how it got past endpoint protection and did that piece. But it was really up to the client at that point. We contained it, and they decided, right? Nope, just restore it. We don't see any damages here. We're going to lose for them as a few hours of work, and they just went on about their day, right?
Yeah. Well,
So
and that brings
you
us
guys
some
wanna-
thoughts around the potential for data extortion and stuff like that, but that's probably a topic for a different day.
I just want to be clear. This was before double extortion. So there was no
Double extortion.
exfiltration at the time. This was pure original ransomware. Yeah.
Yeah. Fun times.
Well, you guys brought some examples. Let's get back to the slide deck and dig into a couple of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So examples of security incidents. So yeah,
Go
let's
back
to the
one
next
for us.
slide.
Sorry about that.
There it is. Oh, you're good. And obviously, these are just a few examples. I think there's plenty of more we could throw out there. We could probably spend the rest of this episode talking about examples if we wanted to. Unusual login location. So an account is accessed from a location or country that's not typical for the user, which could be a sign of suspicious activity. Doesn't mean it's definitely suspicious activity, no, but I think that requires some due diligence to figure out if so and so is typically in Denver and now they're logging in from London. Are they actually in London, or does somebody in London have access to their credentials? Misconfigured firewall, or really any misconfigured devices for that matter. Firewall or security setting is found to be incorrectly set, leaving a gap that could be exploited if not fixed. I think probably a good call out here. This is something that's very much hopefully on the MSP. The way you have your contract set up is ensuring that you're configuring devices properly and not leaving gaps like this. Phishing scam: an employee accidentally clicks on
I
a
want
fake
to
email
dig into
link
that for just a sec. So when you think about a misconfigured
Yeah.
device, misconfigured firewall, this implies two things. One, it implies you know how it needs to be configured, right? So control 4.1 is in place. You're setting things up, 12.1, 4.2 for configuration of network equipment, right? And so you're getting those things. But why do you care if something's now misconfigured? Because it could just be a tech made a mistake. But it could be something else, couldn't it, Dom? Right? Like it could be not a technician.
It could be
making a
real
mistake
bad,
well.
right? Like it could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone could have
Which I
access
guess
to that firewall or
your
admin.
response to that event is hopefully looking back at change tickets and seeing where the change ticket is, where the mistake was made. So hopefully you're doing good change management. But if you're not, then you need to go digging through logs and understand what changed. Like if suddenly 3389 is open and your techs will never do that, we would call that a sign. But if you have good change management, you should have a change ticket where the change was misapplied, which happens, by the way. That's an operational mistake. It's going to happen.
Well,
Exactly.
I think the biggest area, at least at K3 as a smaller growing company, the biggest area I've seen misconfigurations happen is deployment. Usually once you get it wherever it needs to be, there's not a whole lot of changes within our environments that typically need to be made after that. But I think an issue is if you don't have the right standards and SOPs or potentially templates, if you're working with a firewall where you can just deploy out a template on kind of your standard baseline settings, then you're just kind of telling your lead engineer, hey, configure this firewall for me, and hoping that they know what that means. And there's a chance if they don't have the right expertise that you could end up with a really expensive router at the client location with nothing really enabled or configured the way it should be. So I think standards and automating some of that where you can are also kind of important call outs to ensure that configurations or misconfigurations don't happen. And following
100%.
CIS baselines, right?
All right, continue.
All right, so phishing scams. I mean, I know phishing attempts almost never happen, but I figured this was worth putting on there. An employee accidentally clicks on a fake email link and shares company passwords with a hacker. That actually maybe should have been on the breach list. I think I meant to put something else there. Data loss prevention alerts. DLP system detects and stops an attempt to send sensitive company data outside the network, such as through email. Phishing attempts blocked. So that's I duplicated that by accident. I see what happened there. So an email filter catches and stops a phishing email before it reaches an employee's inbox. So in that case, you could theoretically say there was at least an event, maybe an incident where a phishing email was sent out, but it never got to the employee's inbox, so it was effectively squashed before it became a real issue.
Sure.
Cloud footprint.
And that might
So
just be
let's
an
say this is
event too, from your conversation
yeah,
point, that you
yeah,
might classify that as an
totally.
event because there wasn't something past that. So when you get into it, when you talk about Control 17, incident response, as we go into this, there is something about setting clipping levels as the very end of that, right? The last control in 17 is about trying to have different types of levels. So initially you might lump everything as an incident. At Iconic, when we went down this path, like a lot of stuff was called an incident that really should have been an event. And I think that as you get more and more mature, you'll find more where you start classifying things as, oh, that's an event. This is an incident because it
Yeah.
got to this stage, right, within your own levels, and setting those clipping levels of kind of what you're looking for there. So, all right, next.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, one thing I'll add to that, when you think about the evolution of K3, I joined in 2020. We were 4 employees, um, up until, you know, 2023. So we were around 12, and then just K3 Denver, we kind of boomed to somewhere between 15 and 20 over the last year. And now we added 6 more in Dallas. So it's, you think about, and, maybe not all MSPs are growing at the rate, but I think all MSPs have growth to some extent. And
Yeah.
the challenge with that is having the right resources to classify things the right way and keep that all organized, right? And I think that's kind of what we're starting to go through a little bit right now as we kind of start to hone in on how the PSA is set up and things like that. Is how do we want to classify certain things? How is that
Yeah.
managed? What teams are managing those and things to that extent? So
Have
definitely,
you
I would say
gotten
kind of something
to
in that.
have you gotten to using the ticket with its own separate board for your incidents that you're tracking yet, or are you still kind of classifying them in subclass or classifications right now?
Right now, it's we're in Halo, so everything's kind of category based, right?
Oh,
But I
gotcha.
do
Thank you.
think
Sorry.
I think that's probably coming soon. So we're kind of at a phase right now where we're starting to integrate the Dallas team into our PSA. And I think once we get past that, we're going to kind of look at how do we want to structure the teams. And I think, we're even looking at maybe we make 1 or 2 guys kind of devoted to knock and sock type operations. Whereas right now we have, kind of support engineers, lead client engineers, field engineers. They all kind of share some of those responsibilities to some extent. But I think that is going to be kind of in this phase 2 as we look to integrate the teams, is separating things out a
Sure.
bit more, and that will definitely
That's
help
what
with
we ended
the
up doing as well.
classification. Yeah.
It allowed you to have very normalized response, right? Like what we ended up doing towards the end of it was with certain ITIL types, we were just going to move, it was going to auto move to another board, right? We were ConnectWise, so it was board centric, right? And so with certain types, it was going to move to another board, and then a team internal dealt with that as opposed to
Right.
the original front end delivery arm. So sounds like you're going down the same path as us. All right, so we know what an incident is. What are the things that might escalate beyond that in your definition and the things you're looking at? What's a breach in the way you look at it?
Yeah. Yeah. So security breach occurs when an incident leads to unauthorized access, theft, or exposure of sensitive data. Breaches involve confirmed harm, whether that's stolen data, disrupted services, or unauthorized access. I'd say that definition might be a little vague to an extent, and there's,
Yeah.
I think we could probably dive a lot deeper into that. Matt, do you want
Yeah.
to dive deeper into
Well,
that?
and again, it goes back to what I said before, right? Which is a breach is determined by an attorney. And in my mind, it really is much more the first part of those few sentences than it is the latter.
Yep.
I think you get into an interesting challenge when we do know that someone theoretically had access to a system. Whether or not they had access to data is the real determination. So let's say someone compromises credentials and signs into Microsoft Office 365. One would next want to see what mail was touched, what SharePoint files were touched, what data was accessed. And I think that's what people miss a lot is even when we're talking about the CIA triad, we are talking about data, the confidentiality, comma space of data, the integrity, comma space of data, and right the availability thereof of data. So when we talk about these information systems, it's sometimes easy to think a breach would be someone got into my email system. But that's not likely the case. Now, if they touched stuff, forwarded email out, accessed mail, looked at sensitive data, searched in Copilot. Oh, wait a minute. And yeah, that's right. There is actually PowerPone now has a Copilot search feature in it as of Hacker Summer Camp a few weeks ago. Same thing with GraphRunner, which means it's all about the data. So for me, that's what has to be determined. So why do we hire forensics teams? Well, it's because they can come in and get accurate timestamps, accurate information, pull what happened, see if they can find what the threat actor did. Let's look at the net flow logs and see if they established connections and sent 30 gigs out. Let's do these things. In the absence of that, it might be determined it's not a breach. And ask me how I know. When our big case went all the way through, I worked with the attorneys at Lewis Brisbane a lot, every week for an hour for like 18 months. We spent time on, I think they just wanted to bill us. Now that I'm looking back, I actually think they just wanted to bill us $400 an hour. But we sat with them, and the only thing we were trying to determine was, do we have any evidence that data was compromised and accessed outside of the RMM deploying ransomware? That was the whole thing we were trying to solve. So the reason I say it isn't about necessarily the access itself, the nuance that is, I can probably prove that someone signed in. The question is, do I have logs? Do I have information to prove or disprove that someone touched data? So almost every time you see someone sign in with credentials and get past MFA, one does take themselves to the need to figure out forensically and defensively whether there was a breach. Does that make sense? At least as a way to think about this in my mind. And that's where the investigation is going to come in. That's where an attorney is willing to defend it. And sometimes if you haven't done the things that you can prove or disprove, after double extortion, you might find yourself lending towards it's probably a breach by that attorney, just because you can't disprove it because you've done something stupid to destroy the data, which does create risk for an MSP. If you've done something stupid to destroy the data and now they are in a breach when they otherwise might not have been, one could find themselves in a litigious perspective in that regard. Okay, we'll get off my dang soapbox. Y'all just keep trying to pull my rhetoric
classes. Like if we think of the triad, I usually sum it up as if the C of the triad is impacted, it's most likely to be a breach, right? If confidential stuff is no longer, but we could take like a distributed denial of service or DDoS attack. That's very much going to impact the A. Very few business internet circuits can handle that.
Same thing.
So your availability,
but it's probably not going to be a data breach. Yeah.
Right, because there is no inherent access. Right, it's a shitty day or a crappy day.
And I could destroy the integrity by encrypting it, but if I didn't read the data, touch the data, send the data, move the data, then I haven't affected it. Ask me how I know, right? And that's why we didn't have to report it, as it was determined it wasn't a breach. No one touched the data. They simply encrypted 1,200 machines, but they didn't actually touch data, back to Dom's point. And so had Dom taken that case earlier in early form ransomware all the way down, the only thing they'd be trying to prove is while they were in there and before they ransomed, did they do something to steal data? That's pretty much it. Or did they touch data? Did they use data? Did they make it no longer confidential? So I'm sure people in the audience might want to beat us up for some of these summarizations, but that's why we say the attorneys are involved. That's why we say the forensics teams are involved, is to be the ones that are willing to sit on that court stand, if it ever came to be, and argue the point of whether it was a breach or not with somebody. Okay.
Well, and I think being more on the IT/technical side, there's definitely a piece of me that's like, well, thinking the technical term for a breach, did they get access to a system? Technically, they got in, so system was breached, right?
Yeah, 100%.
What you're really diving into more, though, and I think what's important is, we manage a lot of risk, and we have to think about how do we manage that risk and classify things, all of that fun stuff. And to your point, do you really want to call it a breach if you can't really confirm that?
Not until an attorney does.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, remember, our workstations are cattle, right? We don't really care about them. So if it's really all about the data, and some people are going to disagree. Most small businesses would hate me calling their workstations cattle, but they are. I don't care about your workstation. I care about your data.
They are cattle, as long as they don't have juicy data stolen from them. 100%. All right, let's continue. So we beat to death what is a breach by that definition. And I think you guys had a couple of incidents you wanted to share with the audience of things you've dealt with, hopefully very well redacted and without any client information that might get you in trouble. But let's walk through it. Why don't you share?
Oh, for sure. And real quick, I just wanted to go over the part here. I know we want to get to the fun stuff, so I'll just cover this really quick. So since I alluded to earlier that we have a small, tight-knit team, we have to be strategic with the tools that we're using and the vendors that we're partnering with. For example, we don't want to get add a tool to our security stack that's going to maybe overwhelm our service desk or require a lot of care and feed that we can't necessarily provide. So we have to be smart and make sure that our tool sets are able to protect our clients, detect when incidents come in. And then additionally with vendors, like maybe get that expertise that we may not have readily available in the service desk that we can then pass on to our clients, right? So I guess to summarize that real quick too, so these alerts make sense that we're going to go through. Since we're smaller, we use Huntress for our managed detection and response. And then Avanon for our collaboration cloud platforms, because it's not just email based anymore in the cloud, right? It's Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, like you name it. It's all could be an attack.
Yeah, 100%. So from a detection perspective, just to sum this up for people, you have detection capabilities in your Sonic wall. You have Huntress at the endpoint level and Huntress monitoring the identity. And what comes with that, just so y'all know, why does this matter for a smaller or any MSP? It's because you may not have the ability to dig in and go, oh, I see they did something with LSAS, and now it looks like maybe I look at this, they used an encoded pass. No, like most of the time, you're not going to have the forensics capacitance to dig in and figure out what things are being done.
And
that's why you hire an MDR
regardless
vendor.
of the size,
Yeah, go ahead, Dom.
And regardless of the size of your MSP, if you're thinking about that, look into the economic feasibility, because those
True
are
story.
high value, high skilled, expensive resources. And great companies like Huntress and Blackpoint and Avanon has an IRAS service. They're all able to do this because of their scale, right? They're serving many MSPs, so they've achieved economies of scale to hire great talent. But I'm telling you, hiring and retaining an analyst at a small scale, anything is going to be tough, let alone.
And the reason I brought it up
coverage.
is that with a Huntress or a Blackpoint, or name them Avanon in their managed IR side, you have somebody distilling it and looking at it, right? I was just sitting through a Huntress presentation yesterday, and they're like, hey, we get an alert. It goes to an analyst. If it's something that we need to deal with, the analyst is going to look at it. They're going to send back distilled information for the MSP to take next action. You're outsourcing some of that knowledge that should be that indicator. And it goes back to what Ian said in the very beginning, which is we try to gather the information and then supply that to the client to let them make decisions, right? And this is one of those things where you've got somebody else you pay to be the brains to make sure that you're accurate with what you're telling your client, right? You have at least somebody that's done that digging. And I trust the people at Huntress and at Blackpoint to do those economies of scale and take advantage of that correctly. So just want to make sure for any MSPs out there watching, it's very important to understand when you're not doing something that's in your strength or in your scale capacitance.
Exactly. That's perfectly summed that up.
Go ahead, Curtis. You're good.
All right, awesome. So awesome. So I'll go ahead and go into some of these alerts here. So we have a compromised identity, a phishing attempt, and then a endpoint incident. So for the first incident, and I guess to give you a little background on this incident as well. So we recently were onboarding a new client, and during the early stages of the onboarding, we like to introduce our security tools so we can make sure that the environment's safe and there's no issues there. And then also like we're bringing in a safe environment into our ecosystem. So this alert came in during onboarding. So Huntress detected, and I guess to take a step back even further. So Huntress sent an email to our service desk. It created an incident ticket, and then our service desk inbounded the ticket and then is digesting the detection. So Huntress here is basically saying, hey, we found a historic inbox rule name, ... that was created for a user to move emails to the conversation history folder. That's typically not something that a user is going to do. So that was one indicator that something was up.
And then the words they're searching for are pretty big, right?
Yeah.
Look at those.
Yeah, I was going to say,
transfer, bank. It's so good. Continue, Curtis. Sorry.
Yeah. So they were you're right. They were very specific on what they're looking for. So the from address was basically their internal email domain, and they were looking for a wire, transfer, bank, or cash fund, etc. So they were likely trying to send emails out, but that's how they were kind of trying to, I guess, stay hidden.
Well, what they were trying to do, and I've seen this play out before, just for anybody's edification, is where were they forwarding it? Do you remember if it was internal or external? An external mail, I would imagine. Curtis, do you
So
remember?
it wasn't getting forwarded. Can you
Okay.
still hear me?
Yeah, I can. We got you.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So it wasn't getting forwarded. It seems like it was just going into that conversation folder.
Okay. So they might have been hiding that or putting it into a conversation folder and doing others. But oftentimes what they want is, if I'm trying to get into an environment, I'm going to break in. I'm going to start searching for messages that are going to help me out, right? Things that are like an ACH or a wire transfer, somewhere I can inject myself in the middle and steal money, right? But what I don't want to have happen is maybe that person become aware that I'm intercepting a conversation. So what might happen is I then start saying, hey, initially let's get this one folder so we can hunt for things. We're just going to we're going to move a copy there. But then later when we really do intercept and I'm between Dom and Curtis, I want that message maybe to not show up to Dom, so he knows that I'm attacking, if that makes sense. So there's a number of reasons they might be doing it, but it's definitely one of those things where it was either in the initial stage of them trying to find and look for those attempts, or in trying to hijack conversations that were doing that. But it looks like, to your point, if it was going to an internal folder called conversation history or something, then yeah, that would probably be the
I've also
hunting.
I've also seen bad actors basically replicate, usernames. So let's say it's the accounts payable, accounts receivable clerk, and also, once they kind of have that information, what does their invoice look like? Basically put together an invoice with all the same information they would typically see, except guess what? The payment link is going somewhere else now. So I've seen that happen quite a bit as well. So sometimes they don't necessarily even forward in this information out. They want to organize it, see what it looks like, and then now I know exactly what the email flow looks like, conversation flow looks like. I'm gonna go make
Well,
a
and they
domain
could
that
just
looks
download
almost
the
identical.
.eml file, right? Like what I would do is set up a
that
sister
too.
domain, or a IGN homograph attack, or any of those that make me look just like your domain, and I'll just save the .eml file and then import it into my other Outlook and then reply to it, right? So now you have even the thread and the history thread behind it. It looks good. So yeah, great call out. All right, so what did Huntress tell you to do, Curtis?
So next, and that was a great point, Matt. I didn't think about that last point. So from the response standpoint, Huntress automatically revoked all the sessions, logged out the compromised identity, and then disabled the user in Microsoft 365. And then in addition, they disabled the rule so emails would stop getting forwarded there.
Specifically, they disabled the
us,
inbox rule, right? In this case?
Yeah, disabled the inbox rule,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
And the positive with that is it was automatically done and gives our service desk the time to digest the information, log into 365, confirm that this indeed did happen. It's not a false positive. And it cuts out the, essentially it stops the compromise in its tracks there, right?
Right. Well, and that's the point. It's auto-containing to some extent, right? Because that's what you're really talking about is containment. And Dom, you said that was your contract, was really getting to containment. Well, it seems like they logged out the user, killed session tokens. If you all don't realize that, those session tokens by default are on for like 90 days, if I remember correctly. So if you're not killing sessions, those sessions might still be active. So they're killing sessions.
You can change
and
password
then they
all
give
you
you some
want to. That
steps.
token is still good. So kill the
That's
sessions.
exactly right. And that's why token theft is so beautiful. Now, if you look below, it says our service desk has digested the information provided, right? And then you're looking at it. And if you look at what Hunter said from a remediation perspective, it says audit activity for this user, right? So you've contained now, and now it's saying, hey, I want to check that out. And because they've been attacked before, maybe add complex conditional access policies for this user. It sounds like MFA if it wasn't already enabled, which I imagine it probably was, hopefully, and then rotate credentials for them as well, is what they're suggesting in that remediation instructions. Did you let them do at least some portions of that auto remediation? Don't they have some button in their system to allow you to kind of click that and auto remediate some portions of that? Is that right, Curtis?
Yes, yeah, definitely. So, and that goes again with like trusting our vendors, right? So, when high severity issues come up like that, they auto remediate those, and that gives us some time to then respond.
Yeah,
on the service desk
on what
side.
to do. Yeah, make decisions on, are we going to bring in insurance? Do we need to talk about that? And for those of you that don't know, there are some insurance clauses that say if you don't report it at the time, even though you didn't think you had a loss, you may not be able to call upon that insurance at a later date if you haven't met your minimum reporting timeline. They want to get in before it's expensive. They want to deal with it and do the incident response before it turns into that. So it's a balancing act, right? Because if you do contact your insurance, there could be a claim that turns in. It could have some cost that turns in. You could get decline next time. So you have this balance. So customers are always hesitant to call insurance and bring them in, but otherwise you're just at this stage where you've done some containment. You haven't done any investigation, which means even if you respond, you may not be eradicating. You might only be just actually stopping the current moment threat, which is why I like that Huntress did give some advice, adding additional complexity to the.
And in that scenario, they've disabled the user and killed their sessions, right? So that user can't get any work done. And I think that's an important thing to point out. And when you prep your clients for how you're going to respond to incidents, they've got to know that we might leave you in a rough state for a second while we figure out what we're going to do together next, right? So that user, presumably, hopefully doesn't have access to anything anymore, and they're going to be real pissed about it. So the leadership of the customer has to be prepared and understand what happens from here, right? Okay, Sally or whoever, you can't access while we look at this.
Yeah, great call out. Okay, Dom's dog says
that's a great point. And like I said,
yeah.
No, you're good. And then the last thing, like Dom was saying, the recovery portion of it, right? So we've done all the things that Hunter suggested. We've done our due diligence, and then we next have to get the user back on. So we call the user on the phone to make sure that, hey, we can assist them in getting back into their account so they can resume work, right? So that's the last part there. And then I guess the last point too, like when possible, educate the user on how the incident happened, if we can find out how that happened, and that goes into security awareness training.
That's a fantastic call out too, of just the understanding of even you yourself should always have an after action review. What happened? What went wrong? What could we have done to better detect, identify, protect, respond, or recover in this scenario, right? And we used to do those as a quarterly meeting where we'd come in and review incidents one by one, each quarter of the things that went in it, or more urgent if we had something big come up. But for the most part, we did reviews. Just go back and say, did we learn something here? Was there something we fixed in our system or changed in our system to be better? And to your point, educating that user on, hey, that Starbucks coupon you got that you clicked on and put in your password for probably isn't necessary next time, right? Like it's probably bogus. All right, what else we got?
All right, so the next one that we have is a phishing attempt that Avanon sent us. So a little background here. For an email to be released that is marked as phishing or malware or potential phishing, it has to be approved by an administrator first. So the administrator being us, the service desk. So we received this ticket from an end user who said, hey, they said thank you, and the user wrote, but they're basically saying like, hey, this isn't a phishing email. Can you release it because I know who the user is?
So one little call out there. Curtis said Avanon is configured to where we have to allow those emails through. We could set up Avanon to where the users could just go and allow the emails through without any approval. And to Don's point earlier about you have to manage things, you can't just set them and forget them. If we were perhaps an ill-advised MSP that said, hey, we really want to just let the users control their email flow and figure out what they do and don't want to release, that could have ended a lot worse, right? Sorry,
yeah,
Curtis.
100%.
Keep going.
No, that's a great point. So our next part was to respond. So Robert in this, he checked Avanon and we looked for indicators like, hey, is this email malicious? So taking a quick look, there's a lot of red exclamation points, right? So those are probably good spots to start checking for issues. But to kind of go through here, so Microsoft Defender marked it as malware. It had malicious attachments that were .html files, so not something that you're typically going to get. And then additionally, there was the JavaScript attachment, SPF checks failed. So just a laundry list of things that say, hey, this probably shouldn't land in your inbox. After Robert determined that, he sent an email to the user saying, hey, we've confirmed this is malicious. It is spoofing your email and does not originate from who you thought it was, has malicious attachments, and originates from outside of the country. Given that information, we decline to release the email as it is not safe to do so. Please let us know if you have any questions regarding this conclusion. And more often than not, customers are going to be very happy with this type of response, right?
How did Robert take it? Or how did your end user take it? Not Robert. So how did they were they thankful? Did they need more context, or were they just great? Thank you.
This particular one was like, great, thank you. We also advised them like, hey, if you know this sender, like reach out to them through a different means, like call them on the phone and make sure like, hey, did you actually send me this? Like, why are you sending me a JavaScript attachment? I can't get those. So in this scenario, we're good. But if they did have questions, that's what we would advise them next. Like just reach out through a different means.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have to imagine just saying, hey, go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we had a similar support request or restore request a while back, where the domain actually checked out, DKIM, DMARC, all that was good, but there was a malicious attachment and a bunch of other indicators saying, hey, this is something is not good with this email, right? So in that instance, the support engineer reached out to the end user and said, hey, while it does look like it's legitimately coming from their email address, there's all of these indicators that are telling us something bad is associated with this email. Can you reach out to the user and confirm if they were actually sending you an RFP request? So they called them and come to find out that user's account was breached. So that's another
exactly
gotcha right there, I guess you could say.
Compromised. Yeah. There's an incident and the user's account was compromised.
Compromised.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom.
Compromised.
Their email was compromised. And that is the other piece of this too, right? And it could have been breached, right? To your point, Ian, they could have taken sensitive email files. They were obviously trying to expand their reach by using that trust. That's one of the things they're doing here is trying to say, hey, I already got into this account. Now I'm going to go send and take advantage of this. And to your point, Ian and Curtis both, is that if you left the settings where the users could be the most convenient, they would likely be fooled because it is a legitimate email. It is coming from a legitimate place. Yes, it's compromised, and some threat actors doing threat actory things from it. So that's why we put these tools in place, and that's also why we have these administrative stops and administrative controls in place that are saying, no, one of my team, including Curtis, need to be able to say, that's legit or that's not. And I love that you give the advice of reaching back out to the other person because they may not know they're compromised yet. That may be the first way they find out that they've been compromised is when that first flood of emails comes out with the attachments. We've seen it. Dom, you've seen it. We've all dealt with this type of compromise before. So I just wanted to add those couple points. Continue, Kurt.
Oh, that's a great point. All right, so the last one, and I'll go through this one pretty quickly. So this was a low severity incident that came in through Huntress. This one was basically a unwanted application named PC App Store, which is capable of displaying pop-up advertisements and redirecting your homepage, so adware essentially. So they list the remediation steps that we can take, or we can give them the option in Huntress to do it, but it gives remediation instructions and then the footholds. So when our service desk receives this type of ticket, since it's low severity, there's a couple of things that we're checking for here. So we're going to see if, I'll go here, like, is this something that the user should have installed on their PC? Was there a ticket to install this for whatever reason? Like, why would this user have it and how did it get there? Hopefully they don't have local admin access to just install their own thing. So we kind of do a dive into that to see why that application's there. And then after that, Robert confirmed essentially that, hey, this shouldn't be on here. He approved a remediation step, so he deleted the registry key or the footholds and removed the application. And then he updated the ticket notating. So after that, something like this would go to more senior level resource to kind of dig in to see like how that got there and how we can avoid that in the future.
Yeah. You know, what's great about this particular event in my mind is that you've uncovered a couple things. One is do they have local admin rights? How'd they get this thing installed in the first place? That's a fantastic question. And sometimes maybe it's user rights. Like Dom, you can go into deep detail about your wrestling match with Spotify in that regard, right? But
I mean, that one is
from
for
that
sure
perspective,
in app data. That one's in user space. I can see it on the ticket there.
so it's probably user based, and so they didn't have local admin rights, but they were able to run this in the user context is the point, and there weren't sufficient hard names to stop from that at that point. Yeah. And then the other piece is, one of the nice things about having a huntress or a black point or somebody that's sending you this, did you notice how one said severity critical and one said severity low? One might be very defensible in choosing to make that the delineation point upon which you define event versus incident. Right? If you're trying to define what is an event, what do I classify as an incident, you kind of already have. You already said it, right, Curtis? You said, hey, well, when it's a low, my text need to do X. When it's a critical, my text need to do Y. That's the intent of having different types of event classes, right? Of having a critical or a low or a medium or an event versus an incident, and then obviously the one that the attorneys get to define. So one of the things, and maybe I know what our one play may turn out to be, and I got it in my head at least, but one of the things that comes to mind is really just start where you are and get good common ways that you address these things, the ways you talk about them, right? Ian, it's really easy to say breach. It's what's in our lexicon. The news does it all the time. When we talk about breaching, it's getting into something in your head, right? And so how do we fix that? My argument is that we have to have really, really strong language filters and get a lot of these things put in place now, if that makes sense. So when you go through these incidents and mark them up, are y'all at the stage yet where you're numbering and naming your incidents and being able to track them back in their kind of iterative history? Or is it still kind of an ad hoc type methodology that's kind of buried in the tickets at this point?
I would say we don't really have an official kind of incident register like that at this point. It's something we're storing the Form 1 internally for our internal needs, and kind of where I'd say we're at is like a lot of the stuff we're implementing internally for or ISO compliance and things of that nature. I want to kind of figure out, all right, now how do we kind of just do this for everybody? Like that's essentially just how we operate now, whether it's an internal deal or it's a client-facing incident. So most of it's just kind of associated with the ticket number. There might be categories and classifications to an extent. But other than that, you kind of have to dig in the ticket to really get through it.
Well, I sure appreciate y'all coming on and sharing a few of these incidents with us and events with us. And, we got to meander off on a few different rhetorical topics. So I'll apologize to the audience myself for getting deep into some thought there. But I really appreciate y'all. Let's go ahead and wrap the show up and let's go ahead and go to that play of the game.
Yeah, thank you guys very much for having us.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Okay, play of the game. We're going to wrap it up. What are my thoughts on this? I think the biggest takeaway from today is MSPs, as they get started down this journey, are working from a reactive perspective. They're starting to define incidents. They're working with third parties. And in a lot of ways, I think the play of the game really is forcing it so that you do have a way to manage process around incidents. As you heard Ian and Curtis both talk, both of them talked about how this has a certain process. We have configured the tool so that it actually makes us say yes to something to release it. We have chosen not to give it to the users. The users must ask us for it. In fact, you saw in each of them a user saying, hey, I need this. Please help me with that, right? Or an MDR bringing in things to them in that way. And so having an actual incident response process that you define and follow, ways that you manage your speech so you don't say the word breach when it's not a breach, and clear definitions of events, incidents, and things that need to be escalated is the play of the day. Be ready for incident response, y'all.
Game over.
On time. I think you're mastering this whole play of the day thing. All right. Well, that's our show. We appreciate you coming. We are taking next week off for Labor Day week. So bear with us on that, but you will see us on the following week. As always, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave comments. We do try to check them occasionally. Ian, Curtis, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.